Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar for the 9th edition of the Tracking the Sun report. My name is Naeem Dargouth. I'm in the Electricity Markets and Policy group. And I'll start this with just a few housekeeping items. You can enter questions. We'll have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar at the bottom left of your screen. And feel free to ask questions as we go, and we will be answering as many as we can at the bottom of the hour. We'll be recording this webinar, so if you need to drop off at some point, you can always watch or listen to the webinar that you can see on the landing page of Tracking the Sun at trackingthesun.lbl.gov. All the slides that are in the webinar today are also posted. In fact, a longer version of the briefing is posted on the Tracking the Sun landing page as well. You may also be interested in a couple of other things. We have the utility scale solar webinar, which is tomorrow at the same time. You can register for that on our web page. And finally, we just released today a solar report looking at low-priced solar systems, and you can find that publication on our web page as well. So without further ado, my colleague Galen Barbos will be speaking today and talking about the results from our Tracking the Sun report. And I will talk to you again at the question and answer session. Galen?
Great. Thanks, Naeem, and thanks everyone for joining today. So for those that aren't already familiar with it, Tracking the Sun is an annual report. As Naeem mentioned, we just released the 9th edition. And the report is really intended largely to serve as a reference document summarizing trends in the installed price of distributed PV in the United States. This year's report focuses primarily on projects installed through the end of 2015, and then we also have a little bit of preliminary data on the first half of this year. To be clear now, Tracking the Sun focuses solely on the residential and non-residential sectors. We have a whole separate annual report that I mentioned, which focuses on utility scale solar, and so that is the document to look for trends related to the cost or price of utility PV. We'll just be focusing on residential and non-residential here. One new development with Tracking the Sun this year is that we've released more or less the full underlying project level data set, and that can be downloaded through NREL's OpenPV data portal. And we'll be issuing a more formal announcement about the availability of this public data file in a few weeks. And as part of that announcement, we'll also be soliciting suggestions for possible research projects that we, Berkeley Lab, and some of our partners might conduct on behalf of folks within the industry or the policy community. So if that seems like something that you or your organization might be interested in, please keep your eyes out for that announcement. And as we go through the material here today, if there are questions or topics that come to mind that seem like they're an area ripe for further research, please take note and let us know either on the webinar or through this announcement that we'll be issuing in a couple weeks. So Tracking the Sun is really just kind of one piece of a larger portfolio of ongoing research activities by Berkeley Lab and the National Renewable Energy Lab that all kind of focus collectively on solar cost and pricing trends. And I've already mentioned the first two of these, Berkeley Lab's Utility Scale Solar Report and NREL's OpenPV project. In addition, we've been engaged over the past few years with researchers at several universities on a series of projects that involve more in-depth statistical analysis of the data that we collect for Tracking the Sun. Naeem mentioned one specific example of that kind of work series, this paper that was just released this afternoon on low-price PV systems. I'll refer later in this presentation to some of the findings from that study and some of the other ones in the series. But that is certainly kind of one of the key kind of follow-on areas that leverage this tracking the sun data. And then finally, our colleagues at NREL also issue an annual report on PV system costs. And that work is based on kind of a very detailed bottom-up engineering model, and I believe they'll actually be issuing a new edition of that benchmarking report relatively soon. So before delving into the results, I want to just give a bit of background on the data sources and on some key aspects of the data cleaning process for tracking the sun. So to just kind of bear with me on that for a few slides. I think it's important material to understand. So first, just to make sure we're all on the same page, tracking the sun is focused on the installed price of PV, which is to say the upfront dollar per watt price paid by the owner of the PV system prior to any incentives. Now that PV system owner might either be the host customer on whose property the system is installed, or a third-party entity that owns the system and sells the output or leases the system back to the host customer. And I'll say a bit more on the next couple slides about how we deal with third-party owned or TPO systems in the data set. As I mentioned, Tracking the Sun focuses exclusively on residential and non-residential systems. In this context, when we talk about non-residential, we mean roof-mounted systems of any size, so some of them are quite large, as well as ground-mounted systems up to 5 megawatts in size. Ground-mounted systems larger than 5 megawatts are considered utility scale, and those are covered in our separate report. And then last, all of the units in this report are denominated in real 2015 dollars and in DC or direct current system capacity or system sizes. So the data for this report consists of individual project level data, which we collect primarily from state agencies and utilities that administer PV incentive programs, as well as SREC, or Solar Renewable Energy Certificate registration programs and interconnection processes. As we'll see in a couple slides, this is a very large data set, but it's also not without some limitations. So, I mean, first of all, these data are self-reported by installers or customers, and so there's certainly the potential for some inconsistency in terms of what's being reported. Second, the data, these represent transaction prices or sales prices, which is not the same as the cost that's borne by the installer or the developer. So it's just kind of important to keep that distinction in mind. Third, the data, as I mentioned, are historical. And so given how rapidly the market has evolved, prices for systems that were installed last year may already be somewhat out of date relative to what you might hear today if you were to go out and solicit bids or quotes from installers for a new system. And then fourth and finally, we end up scrubbing out of our data sample many, not all, but about 2/3 or so of the third-party owned systems. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide, but really the key thing to note here is just that some of the systems that we screen out here are installed by some of the larger installers in the country. And so the final sample that we use for analysis is skewed a little bit towards smaller installers, though certainly we also include many large installers as well. So this slide really just kind of summarizes some of the basic data cleaning steps. I won't really dwell on this, but wanted to mostly just elaborate a little bit further on this issue of third-party owned systems that I was just talking about. So I think the key distinction here is between what we refer to as integrated and non-integrated TPO systems. So integrated TPO systems are where you've got a single company that both installs the system and then provides the customer financing. And in these cases, there's really no sale of the system that occurs, and so the price that gets reported to incentive programs or to interconnection processes, those prices are typically some sort of appraised value. And because those appraised values are really not the same thing as an actual sales price, we scrub all of those systems out of our analysis. Now then you've got the non-integrated TPO systems where you've got two different entities, a finance provider and the installation contractor who installs the system and then basically sells it to the finance provider who then leases it back to the customer. And in those cases, there is an intermediate sale, right, between the installation contractor and the financer. And that's what gets reported to the incentive programs, and we retain those data in our analysis. And I'll show in one slide later on how the price reported for those non-integrated TPO systems compare to host-owned or customer-owned systems. So here we get some sense for just the overall size of our data sample and how it compares to the larger populations of systems in the US. We actually have basically two different versions of the data sample. There's what we call the full data sample, which is before we really screen out anything. And that consists of about 820,000 individual projects, individual data records. And those represent about 85% of all residential, non-residential systems installed in the US. So very large fraction of the total market represented there. And this is more or less what gets posted online in the public data file. We winnow that sample down by, as I mentioned, excluding the integrated TPO systems. We also, for obvious reasons, eliminate any projects where the installed price data was just missing. And so between really those two screens primarily, we end up winnowing down the data sample to about 450,000 systems. And so that's the final sample that's used for all the figures in this report and really for the remainder of this presentation. Lastly here, I just wanted to say kind of a few aspects about the underlying characteristics of the data sample. These are kind of useful things to note as they help to explain some of the later trends in installed prices. They're also just useful and interesting in their own right because they tell you a little something about the distributed solar market in the US. So there's a lot going on in this slide. Don't worry about absorbing it all. There are basically two important things to understand here. The first is that system sizes are generally increasing over time. We see that most clearly in the figure on the upper left, the green line, which shows median system sizes for residential projects over time. So you can see that's gone up quite substantially over the last 15 years or so. The second key takeaway here is that although the sample has definitely become more geographically diverse over time, California and several other large state markets do continue to dominate the sample. And you can see that in the figure on the lower left. And one related thing to note there is that you can see a clear uptick in the California share of the sample in the last year. And that largely has to do with kind of some transitional issues in data collection responsibilities in California. So historically, much of the data that we received from California was coming through the California Solar Initiative Incentive Program. That program kind of wound down, and as a result, there was kind of a temporary lapse in data collection for California, at least in terms of installed price data. And so that's why in 2014 there was kind of a dip in the California share, and then in 2015, once the data collection responsibilities kind of shifted over to the utilities interconnection process, it ticked back up. And that little oddity in the underlying data sample ends up kind of manifesting itself later on in some of the installed price trends. So with that, let's delve into some of the trends. And we're going to start just at a kind of a high level here, looking at trends in national median installed prices. So here we see how installed prices have evolved over the full time series in our data set going back all the way to 1998. And first and foremost, you can see that there's just been a phenomenal drop in prices over this time horizon. For residential systems where we have kind of the full time series, it's been about a 6% drop per year on average. In the last year of the analysis, from 2014 to 2015, median national prices fell by about 20 cents a watt, 5% per year. for residential systems, and by slightly larger amounts for the two non-residential segments. And this is more or less in line with the long-term rate of decline, but it does mark an apparent slowing in the rate of decline relative to some of the recent years where we saw maybe kind of 3 or 4 years in a row where we had double-digit percentage drops in price year over year. Although I won't really, we also present some preliminary data for the first half of 2016. The trends there are a little bit muddy, but generally suggest that prices, at least for residential and small non-residential systems, have continued to fall into the first half of 2016. Now, one of the more noteworthy aspects of this continued drop in PV system prices is that it's happened despite the fact that the underlying price of PV modules has been relatively flat over the past 3 years. It still has than it did over some of the preceding years. And you can see that in the figure here. So the green line, again, shows the median installed price for residential systems. The blue line is an index of module prices in the US. And so you can see starting around 2009, there's kind of this inflection point where module prices begin a quite steep descent. And total system prices more or less followed suit. But then from 2012 onward, module prices flattened out, but total system level prices continued to fall. And so, of stating the obvious, the driving force behind reductions in system prices over the past 3 years has mostly been a decline in kind of the collective set of non-module costs, which is what that orange line, which is sort of a residual term, shows. Now, we can dig into these non-module cost declines a little bit and make some broad inferences about the relative significance of different underlying drivers. So just to kind of give us a bottom line number to start with, since 2010, non-module costs for residential systems have fallen in aggregate by almost $2, about $1.90 per watt. 8% can be attributed to a drop in the price of inverters and racking. So those are kind of the two main hardware components other than modules. By extension, the remaining 80% largely has to do with a decline in the various quote-unquote soft costs. So this includes things like customer acquisition, installation labor, all the costs associated with navigating the permitting and interconnection processes, as well as not unimportantly installer margins and profit. And these soft costs have fallen on a per watt basis, partly just because of some kind of technical factors. The efficiency of PV modules has increased over time. That's what the chart here shows. And in addition, PV system sizes have increased over time, as we saw a few slides ago. And so both of those dynamics basically allow for fixed costs, and some of the soft costs are kind of fixed in nature to be spread over a larger number of watts. And so that's part of what has contributed to this decline in soft costs over time. But beyond those technical factors, I think it's also safe to say that there's really been tremendous emphasis within the industry, especially in recent years, to target soft costs. And that's happened largely just because those costs now collectively represent the largest share of total system costs. But in addition, and this is what I'll turn to on the next slide, we've also seen that solar incentives have continued to be ratcheted down, and that's certainly helped to kind of keep the pressure on in terms of driving further cost reductions. And so here we see what has happened to incentives. Specifically, what we're showing here are state and utility rebates and performance-based incentives. So we're not including tax credits or net metering or renewable energy certificates here. So this is just kind of part of the incentive pie. But it's at least historically been an important piece of the incentive pie. And you can see that these incentives have fallen quite significantly over the last 10 years or so. Depending on the state, the reductions in these incentives equates to anywhere from between 60% and 120% of the drop in PV system prices over that same time period. So what that means is that even though PV prices have fallen very precipitously, the overall customer economics hasn't necessarily improved in sort of proportional amount, and in some cases maybe it hasn't improved at all if these incentive reductions completely offset the price decline. And so that's just an important thing to kind of keep in mind in terms of understanding what these cost reductions mean for the kind of larger question of customer economics. So I've been deliberate so far in really just talking about changes in PV system prices without saying anything about what those prices are in absolute terms. And the reason I've done that is that any specific price point really needs to be understood within the context of A, the overall variability of system pricing, and B, the diversity of different PV price and cost benchmarks that are out there in the market. And the slide here focuses on the latter of those two considerations. And among other things, it shows that the national median prices drawn from our data set are somewhat high compared to other benchmarks out there, though they're certainly within the broader range. And so, for example, if you look at residential systems on the left-hand side, the median price for systems in our data set was about $4.10 per watt nationally. In comparison, the other benchmarks that we show here, and these are pretty diverse in nature, those range from anywhere from $2.70 a watt to $4.50 a watt. So our national median is within that range, but certainly within closer to the upper end. And then similarly for non-residential systems, you can also kind of see where our numbers line up against some of the other benchmarks out there. Now there are all sorts of logical reasons why these benchmarks differ from one another. In terms of our data, one important one is that most of the systems in our sample are from relatively expensive states. And so when you're looking at an overall national median price, that obviously tends to pull the number up. And then another reason is that, at least in some cases, the reported prices in our data set, they may include items that aren't necessarily included in other benchmarks. Things like loan origination fees or maybe re-roofing costs that are incurred as part of the project. We don't necessarily have great visibility into all of the different cost components that are kind of rolled into the prices that we see, but I think it's probably safe to say that there's some kind of inconsistency in terms of what ultimately gets included from one project to another. In the end, though, I think really the most important thing to note here is just that it's very difficult to talk generically about the price of distributed solar, and it's really important whenever one does sort of talk about that price to be as specific as possible about kind of where the data come from and what assumptions and methods are employed in order to come up with that number. So the last thing I wanted to show before kind of digging into our data a little bit further is to just make a quick comparison to PV system prices in other countries. And the figure here just picked out a handful of some of the larger distributed PV markets and shows that notwithstanding the significant price reductions that we've seen in the US, prices here are still quite a bit higher than in most other countries. And nowhere is this more stark than Germany, where you can see residential systems average about $1.70 a watt last year. Now, hardware costs, modules, inverters, racking, etc., they're certainly not identical across countries, but they're pretty similar, certainly not different enough to explain anywhere close to the differences that we're seeing here. And so it stands to reason that soft costs are really the primary underlying difference. Now, some of those soft cost differences may be just the result of different levels of deployment scale in these countries. I mean, you've got Germany and Japan here, which both have far more distributed PV installed than in the US. That's what the red bars show, and that's on an absolute basis. On the per capita basis, it's obviously even more significant. And so to some extent, these soft cost differences across countries may just be kind of a matter of differences in experience and scale within the national and local industry. However, it's also probably safe to say that there are other factors also at play, things like differences in the business models of solar installers in each country, maybe simpler, more uniform permitting and interconnection processes. That's something that we've heard a lot about. And in some countries, lower incentives that just kind of create more pressure on installers to kind of really squeeze as much efficiency out of their operations as possible. Whatever the reasons are, though, what these international comparisons suggest is that there is certainly some additional cost reduction opportunities that probably exist within the U.S. just in the near term based on kind of replicating as best as we can some of the conditions in other countries. For the rest of the webinar, I'm going to just kind of dig into some of the variability in system pricing and kind of try to understand what's driving that and perhaps more importantly, what that tells us about possible pathways to lower prices going forward. So first things first, we just need to appreciate how variable PV system prices are. The figures on the top show the distribution of prices for systems installed in 2015. You can see quite a bit of spread in all three segments: residential, small non-residential, and large non-residential. Among the residential systems, for example, the median price, as I mentioned earlier, was $4.10 a watt, but across all of the systems installed in 2015, 20% were less than $3.30 a watt. Almost 10% were below $2 a watt. And then, of course, you've got the other end of the spectrum with systems priced above $5 or even $5.50 a watt. So just this really tremendous spread. And there are lots of possible reasons for that. That's the kind of underlying drivers for this pricing distribution is a topic that we've explored through some of the offshoot analyses with our academic partners. It's also some of these possible drivers are things that we'll look at in the following slides. All that said, it's also important to understand that this pricing variability has narrowed over time. And that's what we see on the bottom chart, which shows the gap between the 20th and 80th percentile values over time. And so you can see, back in the early days, there was obviously a very significant narrowing as the market was just kind of beginning to take root in the U.S. And then there was kind of a period where pricing variability sort of undulated a little bit. But then since 2010, you can see that there has been a slow but still steady narrowing in this pricing distribution. And that narrowing is consistent with what we'd expect just given the kind of continued maturation of the market as greater competition emerges and consumers become better informed. So I've alluded to some of the related studies that we've done with academic partners. That work is ongoing. Naeem mentioned a study that just came out today. I'm not going to really talk about all of these. I think I'll just refer you to the web address at the bottom where you can find all of these papers. In many cases, we've also published kind of shorter fact sheets that boil things down into somewhat less technical terms as well. Within tracking the sun, we try to understand some of the drivers behind PV pricing variability using kind of simpler descriptive methods by just kind of cutting the data in different ways. And so here we do this showing how install prices vary by system size. It's clear that with larger systems you get lower prices. That shouldn't come as a surprise. But I think it's just notable to see even how that happens across relatively narrow ranges in system size. If you look at residential systems on the top, you can see when you go from a 2 to 4 kilowatt size residential system up to an 8 to 10 kilowatt size residential system, there's a big change in median prices there, just due to kind of the economies of scale that manifest over that size range. Same thing with the large non-residential systems. There, the range of system sizes is much wider, obviously, and so not surprisingly, the economies of scale are even more significant across that full width. If you were to look at utility scale systems, of course, there would be even further scale economies as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that national median prices can be a bit skewed owing to the fact that most systems are installed in relatively expensive states. Here we see that, and more generally just see how significantly prices can vary across states. So in the figure on the top, which focuses on residential systems installed last year, you can see that most states are below the national median. That's the dashed red line. And that's just because the three biggest residential markets in our data set, California, New York, and Massachusetts, are all relatively pricey, up in the $4 or $4.50 per watt range. And instead, you've got really a good number of states that are over on the left-hand side where median prices are more like $3.50, $3.60 a watt. And these state-level pricing differences can arise for different reasons. We've kind of alluded to some of those on the previous slides and explored some of them through our kind of academic partnerships. There's even things as simple as just sales taxes, differences in sales tax rates, or in some states, exemptions, sales tax exemptions for PV systems. That can lead to differences of as much as 30 cents a watt from one state to another. Now, I think it's important in thinking about these cross-state differences to also keep in mind that pricing within each of these states also varies quite a bit. That's what the error bands show. And that intra-state variability is actually more significant in most cases than the cross-state variability. So I mentioned that just to not overstate the significance of some of these cross-state differences in the context of kind of the overall variability in system pricing. Now, I noted earlier some of the issues surrounding how TPO systems are captured within our data sample. Just to reiterate, we exclude TPO systems installed by integrated companies, but we retain the non-integrated TPO systems where there's an intermediate sale of the system between the installation contractor and the customer finance provider. Now, one might still wonder whether the prices for those retained TPO systems are really comparable to the prices for customer-owned systems, and that's what the figures here show. The figure on the top shows that in general, pricing for the two groups has generally been pretty similar over time, at least kind of when looking at aggregate national statistics. One rather interesting exception is that in the last year, in 2015, within residential systems, TPO systems were about 50 cents a watt less than customer-owned. And there's really kind of one possible explanation that we've thought about, and that's just that we've seen over the last year or two the growth of residential loan programs where there's some sort of origination fee that often kind of gets rolled into the upfront price of the system. And so that might potentially be contributing to that gap that we see emerged in 2015. In the bottom chart where we compare prices for TPO and customer-owned systems at the state level, it's a much more scattered picture. As you can see, in some states, TPO systems are much lower priced than customer-owned, while in other states they're more expensive. And to some extent, this is probably just kind of idiosyncratic variation where we're picking up kind of the fact that in some states maybe there's just a small number of installers that underlie the medians shown here, and so what we're really showing is kind of differences in installer level prices. In other cases, we may be seeing something more fundamental. TPO business models can vary from company to company. In some cases, you've got basically, the installation contractors just kind of doing wrench work. They're not really responsible for acquiring the customers. They are just really, brought in once the customer has already been recruited. And in those cases, you'd expect prices for TPO systems to be less. And so it may be that in some states that kind of model is more prevalent than others. Now, in the end, a lot of the pricing variability that we see can be traced back to differences across installers. And here we show median prices by installer, focusing just on residential systems installed in 2015, and looking at just the 5 largest state markets in our data set. So just to explain what's going on here, each of the dots or data points in the figure represents the median price of an individual installer in a particular state. And then we just kind of rank order those installer level medians, and that's what the lines represent. And so you can see, for example, for installers at the 20th percentile level in each state, prices were, depending on the state, between 80 cents a watt and $1.20 a watt lower than for installers at the 80th percentile, just to kind of give you some kind of benchmark for understanding this cross-installer level variability. So that's clearly very significant. One of the takeaways from all of this is that there are, seemingly some low-price leaders out there. That is, installers who are able to consistently price their systems at or below, say, $3 a watt, and maybe worth trying to understand a bit more about what those companies are doing and whether there are lessons there that might be reproduced more broadly. So I haven't said much yet about technical characteristics of PV systems. There are certainly some important differences here, one being the module technology used. As most of you likely know, most distributed PV systems use some kind of crystalline silicon module technology. But even within that basic technology type, there can be quite a bit of variation in terms of the efficiency and performance characteristics of the module. And the chart on the top here shows the distribution in module efficiency levels across systems in the data set installed in 2015. And you can see that most systems are kind of distributed semi-normally around an efficiency of about 15% or 16%, which is typical for polycrystalline modules. But then there are these kind of peaks or clusters out on the right-hand side of each chart where you can see premium efficiency modules showing up. So that's kind of typical of monocrystalline modules. And those high efficiency modules, one advantage that they provide is that they can offer some savings on balance of systems costs, since you don't need as much space for a given system size. But on the other hand, they're also generally more expensive than kind of standard polycrystalline modules. And so we can see on the bottom chart that systems with high efficiency modules are in fact generally quite a bit more expensive, usually with maybe 50 cents or 60 cents per watt more than for systems with kind of standard efficiency modules. And really what just that suggests is that any savings on balance of systems costs from going to a high efficiency module is probably getting kind of washed out by the higher cost of the modules themselves, at least among the specific kind of module technologies that are present within our data set here. And I will just mention that the figures here are drawn from kind of a subset of our larger sample, since in many cases we don't have data on module model or manufacturer. So this is really just based on that subset where we do have that data. Now I mentioned earlier, actually I think I failed to mention, I should have mentioned earlier, that systems installed on new homes tend to be lower priced than those on existing homes. And here we can see that explicitly, but first it's important to note some technical differences between the new construction market and retrofit market as far as residential PV goes. So the first thing is that new construction systems tend to be quite small. And we see that in the figure in the upper left, which shows that those systems are typically in the kind of 2 to 3 kilowatt size range compared to residential retrofit systems, which are usually more like 5 to 6 kilowatts. The other thing is that new construction systems tend to use premium efficiency modules. That's what the figure on the upper right shows. And as we saw on the last slide, systems with premium efficiency modules tend to be more expensive. So both of those two kind of technical factors will tend to make new construction systems more expensive than retrofits. Amazingly, though, what we see is the opposite, that they're consistently and rather substantially less expensive. And so we see that in the bottom figure, which looks just at systems in California and shows that new construction systems were about 50 cents a watt less than retrofits last year. if we then try to control for some of the technical factors and focus just on kind of small systems that are 1 to 4 kilowatts in size, and just use premium efficiency modules, the difference is even larger, about 80 cents a watt less for new construction systems than for retrofits. So that's pretty significant in terms of identifying at least one market segment where there's clearly the potential for lower costs as far as kind of where to look for cost savings opportunities. Let's see, kind of winding down here. So really I think the last of the findings that I'll share today relate to non-residential systems. So within our data sample, as with the market as a whole, many of the non-residential systems are installed at public or nonprofit institutions, which we refer to collectively here as tax-exempt customers. And as the figure shows, install prices for systems at tax-exempt customer sites are and consistently have been more expensive than other non-residential systems installed at for-profit commercial customer sites. And there are lots of possible explanations or contributing factors here, and no doubt sort of some combination of these are at play. Systems at tax-exempt sites are generally somewhat smaller and also are geographically concentrated in California, at least kind of relative to the sample as a whole. Public institutions may also be more likely to require union labor or domestically manufactured components, which can add cost. They also, in some cases, may have somewhat more involved permitting and procurement processes, which also can add cost. There's a relatively high incidence of systems at tax-exempt sites that are installed on shade or parking structures. And the cost, the incremental cost of that mounting equipment can then get rolled into the overall price. And then lastly, it's perhaps not totally inconceivable to think that public institutions might have somewhat less stringent financial criteria than a for-profit entity, and so that might also contribute to some of the observed higher pricing there. So with that, I'm really just going to kind of end things with a few closing thoughts. And as an annual report, the basic conclusions from tracking the sun don't necessarily change much from year to year, but they, I suppose, become a bit more definitive as they're just kind of reinforced over multiple years. So first off, I think it's clear to say that distributed solar in the U.S. has experienced really dramatic reductions in costs and prices over the last 10 to 15 years. Much of that has happened as a result of reductions in hardware costs, but in recent years, really we've seen kind of soft costs emerge as an important, if not kind of the most important source of continued cost reductions. And this is encouraging. There's really been a tremendous shift and focus in the industry to try to reduce soft costs, and there's been lots of public R&D focused on this as well. I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the initiatives within the Department of Energy's Sunshot program to try to facilitate soft cost reductions. And so the fact that we're seeing those costs starting to fall suggests that these collective efforts are beginning to bear fruit, and this is encouraging because soft costs are really the one area where state and local entities have some leverage. All that said, I think it's also safe to say that rather substantial further reductions will still be needed in order for distributed solar to remain economically viable over the long run. And those cost reductions are probably going to need to come primarily on the soft cost side as well, if only for the simple reason that hardware costs are just an increasingly small part of the overall system price. I think the good news is that there's plenty of examples today where we see much lower soft costs. We see that abroad in Germany and elsewhere. We see that even in the U.S. just when we kind of inspect the tremendous variability of system pricing. And so some of what can be done really just kind of comes down to identifying and trying to replicate some of the best practices that are really already in place today. And some of that will happen just by virtue of kind of increasing deployment of distributed PV through greater scale and experience. But I think it will also really continue to be important to think about how policies and how public and private research activities can identify new and innovative ways to drive soft costs down further. And these issues that I believe will continue to be really kind of at the center of the distributed solar market for a long time. With that, before we turn it over to Q&A, just wanted to point you towards various locations on the internet and elsewhere where you can find more information. So the first one here is just our report landing page where you can get the report. As Naeem mentioned, we have a briefing posted there, some summary data tables. We'll post the webinar recording there as well. The second item here is where you can download the public data file. And we'll be updating that kind of periodically over time as we develop sort of additional data fields that build off of kind of the core set of fields. The third item here is just kind of our general publications page where you can find other research by our group on renewable energy. Definitely suggest going there and signing up for the email list. We've got a bunch more reports coming out over the next couple weeks. And then we've got our group's Twitter handle if you're into that. And then lastly, just contact information for Naeem and myself. You should feel free to contact either of us if you've got follow-up questions, especially if you've got ideas about other things that we could be doing with this data. We're quite keen on getting people's thoughts on that. So with that, I think Naeem has been collating folks' questions, and we've got maybe 10 or 15 minutes to answer some of those. So Naeem, I'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Galen. So we have a number of questions here. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll get to all of them given the number, but we can certainly try. So in no particular order, there were a few questions just, I guess, about our costs in the U.S. compared to other countries, for example, Australia. Are there any kind of insights we have as to why prices in the U.S. are significantly higher than those other countries?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, we've done some work into that. Others have done some work as well. In terms of our own work, we did a paper, gosh, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, perhaps, comparing the U.S. and Germany, and really focusing there mostly on soft costs. And we kind of broke soft costs down to a number of different categories. And in Germany, I mean, it was really kind of the soft costs were lower across the board. I mean, there wasn't any one single kind of soft cost category that stood out as being kind of the primary source of difference. It was really across the board. RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, has done some really great work focusing on installation labor costs and processes, looking at both Germany and Australia compared to the U.S., doing some time and motion studies and kind of identifying some kind of very specific techniques and strategies within just kind of the installation process that can be gleaned from other states. So there's, I think, a whole host of different reasons. I'm sorry I can't kind of give, the one sort of magic bullet, but unfortunately it's kind of across the board there seem to be opportunities.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions about why specific states are not included in the analysis. One that was mentioned was Hawaii.
Yep. Yeah. No. So that's very good observation. So our data come primarily from state incentive programs and utility incentive programs. Unfortunately, in Hawaii, they do have a statewide tax credit program. That's kind of the main incentive program that has existed in Hawaii. But unfortunately, they don't really collect system-level data through that program that we could use for our analysis. And so that's why they're excluded. And yeah, I think that they're probably the main gap in our analysis. There are some other states where we have some coverage, but it's kind of incomplete and partial coverage. Maryland is one where the incentive program really only covers a pretty small part of the overall market. And so for Maryland, for example, I think I can't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere on the order of maybe 10% of the market is represented in our data set.
There's a question. So you showed the price breakdown for premium versus non-premium modules. Are there any other PV system characteristics that are not soft costs that you've looked at to understand if there are differences in trends in prices?
No, not really. With our data set, the basic unit of observation is the total installed price. And we don't really have great visibility within our data into kind of the underlying component level costs. We kind of make some inferences there, but there are other studies out there that are kind of have more granularity in terms of the underlying cost structure. So GTM research, they do some great work kind of breaking down system level costs. NREL, they do some similar work, also kind of developing kind of cost estimates based on bottom-up analysis. So those are really the places to look to kind of understand at a kind of granular component level where some of the cost reductions are happening.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we did look at inverter. So we did do a breakup of microinverter versus central string inverters. And the details of those trends are in the report.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Naeem. And actually, let me call up this slide. I forgot about it. It's at the end. So here we actually do compare system level prices between those projects that have module level power electronics, so either microinverters or DC optimizers, versus those that just have standard string inverters with no module level power electronics. And yeah, I mean, I think bottom line is we don't see really any discernible difference in install price here. It's hard to know what conclusion to draw from that because really the incremental cost of module level power electronics is pretty small relative to the overall variation in price in our data set. So it may just be kind of getting washed out in the noise. But we haven't really seen in any year that systems with module level power electronics are kind of significantly higher priced than those without.
There were just a couple of questions on where you can download the presentation slides. So just a reminder, you can go to trackingthesun.lbl.gov. Right here, it's the first link. And you'll see that there's a briefing which includes all of the slides covered today, as well as some additional slides. So it's a more extensive briefing. So if you go to that site, you can download all the slides. There was one question to see how do we explain prices that are higher in some states such as Minnesota, New Mexico, and North Carolina. Those aren't. Do we have any kind of insights as to why prices in some states are higher than others?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there are differences across states just in kind of the level of maturation of the solar market. So, how many installers are present, kind of how much experience the installers have in those markets, and how kind of competitive the markets are. So in some cases, you may have some states where the market is kind of just in more kind of early stages of development. And so in those cases, often you can see higher prices and often more variable prices as well. That being said, of course, California and Massachusetts and New York all have, pretty mature PV markets, relatively speaking, and they tend to have higher prices. So it's not just a matter of kind of local market experience, but I think, all else being equal, that tends to be an important driver. Incentive levels can also be important. So, often folks talk about value-based pricing, which is really just a fancy way of saying, profit-taking installers being able to charge kind of more than they would if the market were kind of perfectly competitive. And there's some evidence that happens or can happen. I mean, we see places with higher incentives often have higher prices. And now some of that may just be that if you have higher incentives, you have more demand, and you have, that higher demand will support higher prices. That's just kind of basic kind of supply and demand, kind of pushing the supply curve out farther along the demand curve. But incentives can certainly play a big part, and that includes not just kind of explicit rebates and such, but also net metering and utility rate structure.
There was one question, just kind of a definition question on how do we define soft costs, or what costs are included in the soft cost category?
Yes, I mean, I think soft costs, I guess the simplest definition is everything other than hardware costs. And there are maybe different ways of kind of parsing that out. I think the categories that often get used are customer acquisition, installation labor, interconnection, and permitting costs, at least in terms of like the kind of the administrative process. Financing costs are often included. Tax is often included. I think, am I forgetting anything else, Naeem? Those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
Yeah. Great, and we have time for maybe one more question before we reach the bottom of the hour. I'm going to combine two questions. One was about a breakdown of costs of non-residential roof-mounted versus non-residential ground-mounted. And there was another one trying to understand if there are differences or a breakdown in costs between tracking.
So this is great. You guys have managed to ask about two of the slides that I moved to the end of the presentation because I didn't think I'd have time to get to. So here actually we do exactly that. We focus just on non-residential systems and break them out into ground-mounted versus roof-mounted, and among the ground-mounted one, those with tracking versus those that are fixed. I think the first and important thing to note here is that these are very small sample sizes that we're dealing with. Unfortunately, we just don't have good data on the mounting structure for most of the non-residential systems, and so there's a lot of noise here. But that being said, you can see pretty consistently, and for obvious reasons, systems with tracking have been more expensive than those without tracking. The exact differential varies a lot from year to year, but in general, you're looking at something on the order of maybe 20, 30 cents a watt. And in terms of ground-mounted versus roof-mounted, so that would be like if you're looking at the light blue bars in the figure here versus the yellow bars. Those, we often see the ground-mounted systems are a little bit more expensive than roof-mounted. These, in general, these are not like utility scale systems, right? These are, at typically, commercial customer sites. The ground-mounted systems are probably often, or at least in many cases, have kind of shade structures or parking structures involved, and so that can bump up the cost of those systems. But you also, have some additional site development costs associated with ground mounting, and so that may also be at play here.
Great. So it is 11 o'clock Pacific time, and that concludes our webinar. We'd like to thank everyone who joined us. And again, if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to email us. And of course, the entire data set is online, so you can do your own analysis or breakdown of costs there. Thanks again.